Hi, my name is Richard Mahoney. I'm the publisher of the Glengarry News, and I've been asked to speak to you about Ralph Connor, or Reverend Charles Gordon, as he's also known in his real day job. Most of you probably wouldn't need an introduction to Dr. Charles William Gordon, because he's a pretty famous guy. Like his father, in his day job, Reverend Gordon was a Presbyterian minister, but he had another life, one that would bring fame to himself and his native Glengarry. When he was not writing sermons, the minister was working on his fictional work, based on rural life in Canada in the years following Confederation. He opted for a nom de plume because he felt, and rightfully so, it would be unseemly for a clergyman to be associated with the fiction created by his alter ego. Gordon was born in 1860 in St. Elmo, and by the time he passed away in 1937 in Winnipeg, he had established himself as one of the best-selling Canadian authors ever. For more than a third of a century, he was the most famous of all living Glengarrians. The London Times obituary said, and I quote, "He was known wherever the English language is read." He spent most of his life in Western Canada, although his most famous works were based in Glengarry. In the early 90s, Ralph Connor was required reading in Canadian schools. At that time, Glengarry School Days was a bestseller. At the center of this beloved tale is a log schoolhouse, based on the one which was located beside his father's manse. Ralph Connor was prolific and popular. He published more than 24 novels between 1897 and 1936, along with a couple of nonfiction works, numerous booklets, pamphlets, and short stories. To this day, some people still treasure his sermons. In the early part of the 20th century, he was huge. He was a Margaret Atwood of his day, really, probably almost as popular as Adele, perhaps, enjoying an international reputation. Movies were made about his books. I just found out recently that there are 2 silent movies made about his books. The Man in Glengarry got the silent treatment in 1922, Glengarry School Days in 1923. But they weren't shot in Glengarry. I'm not really sure how popular they were. They were probably made in the States somewhere. That's silent era. They turned out a lot of movies. 3 of his novels, Black Rock, The Man from Glengarry, and Glengarry School Days, sold a combined 5 million copies. And think about that, 5 million copies. In an era where we didn't have technology, marketing, Facebook, Twitter, all these other demons of modern society. That was in an era when people probably didn't even have access to radios in their home. Wireless radios were just becoming common in those days, and transcontinental railways were just being built. There obviously was an appetite for books, and readers could see themselves in Gordon's stories. In fact, today there's still a lot of debate about which real-life characters are portrayed in Glengarry School Days. The Man from Glengarry, which was published in 1901, spent several months on the top ranks of the New York Times Books on Demand list. And Connor was also a unique figure in literary circles because he did pretty well for himself financially. He was a rare Canadian novelist. The proceeds of his writing actually made him wealthy. In 1910, in fact, he was listed by the Winnipeg Telegram as being one of Winnipeg's 19 millionaires. However, while his fame remained, his fortune was fleeting. His earnings from his books were lost through no fault of his own, but he accepted the loss. According to Royce McGillivray in his Dictionary of Glengarry Biography, and I quote, "He bore, with remarkable resilience and something almost like indifference, the discovery that his lawyer, who was killed in World War I, had wasted the fortune Connor had accumulated through his writings." The Gordon family left Glengarry when Charles was 10 years old. He and his parents, the Reverend Daniel Gordon, and his wife, Mary Robertson, moved to Oxford County in Ontario. Writing obviously ran in the family. Earlier, Gordon's aunt, Margaret Murray Robinson, had, in 1866, published her own book about the early Glengarry settlers. It was called Sheenack's Work at Home. The Robertson book has been called both remarkable and, quote, culturally important. Charles Gordon, following in his father's footsteps, was ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1890. He would later venture out into the Canadian Rockies, where he was a missionary to lumbermen and miners. As Royce McGilvery notes, his vivid, detailed, and essentially accurate descriptions of Glengarry County were based primarily on his recollections from his childhood. Royce adds, however, during his many years in Winnipeg, he was in contact with numerous Glengarrians who were Winnipeg residents or visitors to the city. If he did not revisit Glengarry, Glengarry came to visit him. He was never idle. He served as a chaplain during World War I. He took up social causes. He helped found the United Church of Canada. He's still fondly remembered in the West. You can visit the Ralph Connor Memorial United Church and a plaque in Canmore, Alberta, that pay tribute to him. His former Winnipeg home was designated as a National Historical Site of Canada. So obviously, based on his sales, Ralph Connor appealed to a wide audience, even though his writing was literally a little preachy. The morality is blended with adventure and romance. His characters are tough, hard-drinking, and lovable. And what else could you ask for? Of course, today, when seen through a more contemporary lens, so to speak, some of his books that were penned in the early 1900s would be considered offensive, tone-deaf, maybe even racist. In fact, Reverend Gordon has been criticized as being, quote, a social gospeler using, again, quote, imperial adventure fiction and muscular Christianity. As I mentioned earlier, he was a prominent figure in both the Presbyterian and United Church, propagating the faith in Western Canada. His characters at times thumped the Bible, and at other times they just thumped each other. His preface to The Man from Glengarry notes, quote, his is a two-fisted Christianity, or as he said in his autobiography, a religion that can appeal to red-blooded people who aren't afraid to engage in physical conflict for causes that they know are right. Describing one of his characters, Connor writes, fighting was like wine to him when the fight was worthwhile. The Man from Glengarry is about a character named Ranald MacDonald, who moves to British Columbia from rural East Ontario shortly after Confederation. There's a wistful tone to this book. The preface reads in part, and again I quote, the solid forests of Glengarry have vanished, and with the forest the men who conquered them. The manner of life and the type of character to be seen in these early days have gone too and forever. It is the purpose of this book to picture them and their times, that they may not drop quite out of mind. The men are worth remembering. They carried the marks of their blood in their fierce passions, their courage, their loyalty, and to the forest in their patience, their resourcefulness, their self-reliance. But deeper than all, the mark that reached down to their heart's core was that of their faith, for in them dwelt the fear of God. Their religion may have been narrow, but no narrower than the moles of their lives. It was the biggest thing in them. It may have taken a somber hue from their gloomy forests, but by reason of a sweet, gracious presence dwelling among them, it grew in grace and sweetness day by day. In the Canada beyond the lakes, where men are making empire, these sons of these Glengarry men are found, and there such men are needed. He goes on to write about, for not wealth, nor enterprise, nor energy, can build a nation into sure greatness, but men, and only men with the fear of God in their hearts, and with no other. And to make this clear is also a part of the purpose of this book. He goes on, The Man from Glengarry has a scene where these shantymen come into a tavern, and it's based on MacDonald and his cohorts. I'll just go read a couple sentences from that. The tavern was full of Murphy's gang, a motley crew, mostly from French Canadians and Irish, just out of the woods and ready for any devilment that promised excitement. Most of them knew by sight and all by reputation. MacDonald and his gang, far from the furthest reaches of the Ottawa, down the St. Lawrence to Quebec, the MacDonald gang of Glengarry men was famous. They came, most of them, from that strip of country running back from the St. Lawrence through Glengarry County, known as the Indian Lands, once an Indian reservation. They were sons of the men who had come from the Highlands and Islands of Scotland in the early years of that century. Driven from homes in their land of the fathers, they had set themselves with indomitable faith and courage to hew from the solid forest homes for themselves and their children that none might take from them. They were bound together by ties of blood, but also by bonds that were stronger than those of blood. Their loneliness, their triumphs, their sorrows, born of their common lifelong conflict with the forest and its fierce beasts, knit them in bonds close and enduring. The sons born to them and reared in the heart of the pine forest grew up to witness that heroic struggle with stern nature and to take their part in it. And mighty men they were. Their life bred in them hardiness of frame, alertness of sense, readiness of resource, endurance, superb self-reliance, a courage that grew with peril, and withal a certain wildness which at times deepened into ferocity. By their fathers their forest was dreaded and hated, but the sons, with rifles in hand, trod its pathless stretches without fear, and with their broad axes they took toll of their ancient foe. For while in spring and summer they farmed their narrow fields and rescued new lands from the brule, in winter they sought the forest, and back on their own farms or in the shanties, they cut saw logs or made square timber their only source of wealth. He's on described his shanty life. It was full of hardship, obviously. They're poorly housed, constantly living the danger of working the bush. But they also come across as being strong, heroic figures. Connor describes MacDonald, the hero of this piece, as being none like him. A giant in size and strength, a prince of broad-axe men, at home in the woods, sure-footed and daring on the water, free with his wages, and always ready to drink with a friend or fight with a foe. The whole river admired, feared, or hated him, while his own men followed him into the woods, onto a jam, or into a fight with equal joyousness and devotion. Fighting was like wine to him when the fight was worthwhile, and he went into the fights. His admirers were always arranging for him with the easiest good humor and a smile on his face. So, over 100 years later, the work of the man from Glengarry, or more specifically from St. Elmo, stands the test of time. Thanks for listening and watching. That's the man himself. That's Ralph Connor. It's a picture of him in his later years, obviously.
Hello, my name is Marilyn MacSweyn. Now that Richard has given you a very thorough and interesting account of the life and times of our notable Glengarry author, Ralph Connor, I am going to introduce you to one of his many books. Having taught school for 35 years, I felt it was appropriate that my first choice would be Glengarry School Days. I was naturally drawn to this book as all of my elementary education took place in a one-room schoolhouse, somewhat similar, I suppose, to that of Ralph Connor days, plus the fact that as a student teacher in the early 1960s, I spent 1 week practice teaching in the one-room schoolhouse SS number 3, Spring Creek, under the capable tutelage of Mrs. Bessie Fraser. What a daunting experience. All-day lessons for 8 grades. I rarely went to bed before 1 a.m. all that week. And now, without further ado, I will take you back to the one-room schoolhouse of pioneer days, as viewed through the eyes of Ralph Connor, in his book, Glengarry School Days, Chapter 1, The Spelling Match. The 20th school was built of logs hewn on 2 sides. The cracks were chinked and filled with plaster, which had a curious habit of falling out during the summer months. No one knew how, but somehow the holes always appeared on the boys' side, and being there were found to be most useful, for as looking out of the window was forbidden, through these holes the boys could catch glimpses of the outer world. Glimpses worth catching, too, for all around stood the great forest, the playground of boys and girls during noon hour and recesses. An enchanted land, peopled not by fairies, elves, and other shadowy beings of fancy, but with living things, squirrels and chipmunks and weasels, chattering groundhogs, thumping rabbits, and stealthy foxes, not to speak of a host of flying things, from the little gray bird that twittered its happy nonsense all day to the big-eyed owl that hooted solemnly when the moon came out. A wonderful place, this forest, for children to live in, to know, and to love, and in after days to long for. It was Friday afternoon, and the long, hot July day was drawing to a weary close. Mischief was in the air, and the master, Archibald Munro, or Archie Munro as the boys called him, was holding himself in with a very firm hand, the lines about his mouth showing that he was fighting back the pain which never quite left him from the day he had twisted his knee out of joint 5 years ago in a wrestling match, and which, in his weary moments, gnawed into his vitals. He hated to lose his grip of himself, for then he knew he should have to grow stern and terrifying, and rule these young imps in the forms in front of him by what he called afterwards, in his moments of self-loathing, sheer brute force. That he always counted a defeat. Munro was a born commander. His pale intellectual face, with its square chin and firm mouth, its noble forehead and deep-set gray eyes, carried a look of such strength and indomitable courage that no boy, however big, ever thought of anything but obedience when the word of command came. He was the only master who had ever been able to control without at least one appeal to the trustees, the stormy tempers of the young giants that used to come to school in the winter months. The school never forgot the day when big Bob Fraser answered back in class. For before the words were well out of his lips, the master, with a single stride, was in front of him, and laying two swift, stinging cuts from the rawhide over big Bob's back, commanded, "Hold out your hand!" in a voice so terrible, and with eyes of such blazing light, that before Bob was aware, he shot out his hand and stood waiting the blow. The school never, in all its history, received such a thrill as the next few moments. For while Bob stood waiting, the master's words fell clear-cut upon the dead silence. "No, Robert, you are too big to thrash. You are a man. No man should strike you, and I apologize." And then big Bob forgot his wonted sheepishness and spoke out with a man's voice, "I am sorry I spoke back, sir." And then all the girls began to cry and wipe their eyes with their aprons, while the master and Bob shook hands silently. From that day and hour, Bob Fraser would have slain anyone offering to make trouble for the master, and Archibald Munro's rule was firmly established. He was just and impartial in all his decisions, and absolute in his control, and besides, he had the rare faculty of awakening in his pupils an enthusiasm for work inside the school and for sports outside. But now he was holding himself in and with set teeth keeping back the pain. The week had been long and hot and trying, and this day had been the worst of all. Through the little dirty panes of the uncurtained windows, the hot sun had poured itself in a flood of quivering light all the long day. Only an hour remained of the day, but that hour was to the master the hardest of all the week. The big boys were droning lazily over their books. The little boys in the forms just below his desk were bubbling over with spirits of whose origin there was no reasonable ground for doubt. Suddenly, Hughie Murphy, the minister's boy, a very special imp, held up his hand. "Well, Hughie," said the master for the 10th time within the hour, replying to the signal, "Spelling match!" The master hesitated. It would be a vast relief, but it was a little like shirking. On all sides, however, hands went up in support of Hughie's proposal, and having hesitated, he felt he must surrender or become terrifying at once. "Very well," he said. "Margaret Aird and Thomas Finch will act as captains." At once there was a gleeful hubbub. Slates and books were slung into desks. "Order or no spelling match." The alternative was awfully enough to quiet even the impish Hughie, who knew the tone carried no idle threat, and who loved the spelling match with all the ardor of his little fighting soul. The captains took their places on each side of the school, and with careful deliberation began the selecting of their men, scanning anxiously the rows of faces, looking at the maps or out of the windows, and bravely trying to seem unconcerned. Chivalry demanded that Margaret should have first choice. "Hughie Murray," called out Margaret for Hughie. Though only 8 years old, had preternatural gifts in spelling. His mother's training had done that for him. At 4, he knew every Bible story by heart and would tolerate no liberties with the text. At 6, he could read the third reader. At 8, he was the best reader in the 5th. And to do him justice, he thought no better of himself for that. It was no trick to read. If he could only run and climb and swim and dive like the big boys, then he would indeed feel uplifted. But mere spelling and reading, that was nothing. "Ranald MacDonald," called Thomas Finch, and a big lanky boy of 15 or 16 rose and marched to his place. He was a boy one would look at twice. He was far from handsome. His face was long and thin and dark, with a straight nose and large mouth and high cheekbones. But he had fine black eyes, though they were fierce, and had a look in them that suggested the woods and the wild things that lived there. But Ranald, though his attendance was spasmodic and dependent upon the suitability or otherwise of the weather for hunting, was the best speller in the school. For that reason, Margaret would have chosen him, and for another which she would not for worlds have confessed even to herself. And do you think she would have called Ranald MacDonald to come and stand up beside her before all these boys? Not for the glory of winning the match and carrying the medal for a week. But how gladly would she have given up glory and medal for the joy of it, if she had dared. At length the choosing was over, and the school ranged in 2 opposing lines, with Margaret and Thomas at the head of their respective forces, and little Jessie McCrae and Johnny Aird, with a single big curl on the top of his head, at the foot. It was a point of honor that no blood should be drawn at the first round. To Thomas, who had second choice, fell the right of giving the first word. So to little Jessie at the foot, he gave ox. O-X, ox, whispered Jessie, shyly dodging behind her neighbor. In, said Margaret to Johnny Aird. I-S, in, said Johnny stoutly. Right, said the master, silencing the shout of laughter. Next word. With like gentle courtesies, the battle began. But in the second round, the little ABCs were ruthlessly swept off the field with second book words and retired to their seats in supreme exultation amid the applause of their fellows left in the fight. After that, there was no mercy. It was a give-and-take battle, the successful speller having the right to give the word to the opposite side. The master was umpire, and after his next had fallen, there was no appeal. But if a mistake were made, it was the opponent's part and privilege to correct with all speed, lest the second attempt should succeed. Steadily and amid growing excitement, the lines grew less, till there were left on one side Thomas with Ranald supporting him, and on the other Margaret with Hughie beside her, his face pale and his dark eyes blazing with the light of battle. Without varying fortune, the fight went on. Margaret, still serene, and with only a touch of color in her face, gave out her words with even voice, and spelled her opponents with calm deliberation. Opposite her, Thomas stood stolid, slow, and wary. He had no nerves to speak of, and the only chance of catching him lay in lulling him off to sleep. They were now among the deadly words. Parallelopiped, challenged Hughie to Ranald, who met it easily, giving Margaret hyphen in return. Hyphen, spelled Margaret, and then with cunning carelessness gave Thomas heifer. Heifer, she called it. Thomas took it lightly. Heiper, like lightning. Hughie was upon him. Heifer, Fer, shouted Thomas. The two yells came almost together. There was a deep silence. All eyes were turned upon the master. I think Hughie was first, he said slowly. A great sigh swept over the school, and then a wave of applause. The master held up his hand. But it was so very nearly a tie that if Hughie is willing... All right, sir, cried Hughie, eager for more fight. But Thomas, in sullen rage, strode to his seat, muttering, I was just as soon anyway. Everyone heard and waited, looking at the master. The match is over, said the master quietly. Great disappointment showed in every face. There is just one thing better than winning, and that is taking defeat like a man. His voice was grave and with just a touch of sadness. The children, sensitive to his moods, as is the characteristic of children, felt the touch and sat subdued and silent. There was no improving on the occasion, but with the same sad gravity, the school was dismissed, and the children learned that day one of life's golden lessons, that the man who remains master of himself never knows defeat. The master stood at the door, watching the children go down the slope to the road, and then take their ways north and south till the forest hid them from his sight. Well, he muttered, stretching up his arms and drawing a great breath, it's over for another week. A pretty near thing, though. Having read Chapter 1 of Glengarry School Days, I hope I have whetted your appetite for these books, and you will find a copy and indulge yourself in the days of yore so well recounted by Ralph Connor.